saw the car pull up behind me. Some white boys. I mean, they ain't said nothing about what they're gonna do to me.
This bitter earth.
They put me in the car, then went blindfold me.
What the fruit it bears.
I was begging them to leave me alone. Don't shoot me. I got to go home to see about my baby. They wouldn't let me go. I can't help but tell the truth. What they done to me.
And if my life is like the dust.
Every time I go there, I look down that road. Try to remember them trees.
The glow of a rose. But what good am I? Heaven only knows.
Everybody, please give a round of applause for acclaimed filmmaker Nancy Buirski. Let's hear it. Nancy, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on the film. It's heartbreaking and beautiful and haunting. Your choice of finding these films from this period of time that this took place and intercutting it with the testimonies of the people close to the story is incredibly effective and revealing of that period of time. I want to talk about that decision in a minute, but let's talk about how you found Recy Taylor's story.
You know, I made a film earlier called The Loving Story, and I've been interested in subjects like this, hidden stories about America, about race. And someone handed me a book called At the Dark End of the Street by Daniel McGuire. And in that book, McGuire traces the history of African-American women from Recy Taylor's day right up through the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power. The first few chapters deal with Recy Taylor, and I was just gripped by that story. I couldn't believe I didn't know it. I couldn't believe I knew so little about the chronic rapes that were taking place during that period. I knew about lynching, but I didn't know about, you know, this staggering number of women who were being raped. And I didn't know about how important the women in that period were to the ultimate civil rights movement. I just felt it was a story that had to be told.
You do such a wonderful job with this in the same way that you did with The Loving Story, which is finding this moment in history that ends up being a kind of microcosm for not just the progress that took place, but issues that we're also dealing with right now in the moment. In many ways, The Loving Story, both in the documentary and then in the subsequent narrative film that you produced, ends up sort of revealing itself as a kind of parallel for marriage equality in a lot of ways. And in the same way, this sort of ends up revealing itself as to what we're dealing with now in regards to women's bodies and particularly black women's bodies and black bodies overall. Was that something you were fully aware of when you started trying to sort of tell this story?
You have an instinct about something like that. You have an instinct that, you know, you may be looking at something through the lens of history, but it really isn't history. You know, that I like to think of it as reality reconsidered. And
we're never through with history.
Exactly. You know, we go back and we revisit these things time and again. And I think those two stories in particular are such examples of how, unfortunately, things don't change as much as we hope they would. You know, we're almost overly optimistic as a culture that, you know, we get through a particular decade and then we move on. But unfortunately, for every step forward, we end up taking a few steps back, too. So
I think that one of the reasons, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you with something that's not a question but an opinion, but I completely agree with you. And I think one of the reasons that that happens to us culturally is the way that we tell historical stories. I think you do a wonderful job in both this and in the other two projects that I spoke of, in revealing that history is never over. It's a constant battle in moving forward. But oftentimes, especially when it comes to narrative fiction, Hollywood movies, it always feels like there's a period at the end of history. You know that we struggled and we won, and that's the end of it.
Well, that's one of the disconcerting things about those movies, actually, that they do have an ending. And though I'd like to think the structure of my films have a beginning, middle, and end, I'd like to think they're also left open to a certain extent. The Loving Story felt like it was a little better resolved. We had a court case, and they were able to go back to Virginia and live together. They were no longer, you know, considered criminals in the eyes of the justice system. Okay, so that felt maybe it was over. I was aware when I was making that film that we were dealing with gay rights. I mean, there were the Proposition 8 in California had just been kind of rearing its head, and also Obama was just campaigning for the White House. So there was a lot of stuff that was going on that made me feel this film was relevant. But I didn't know we'd go back to some of the same attitudes. That's really what has concerned me now, that it's not just a different element that we're looking at, but it's the same one. There's still people that are against interracial marriage. You know, there's still people that have that kind of bias in our society. And so this stuff doesn't end. And in Recy Taylor's case, she didn't get the justice that she deserved. So that, you know, our film really leaves that open-ended.
Well, you leave it open-ended. You also, I think, in the last minutes of the film, I'm not giving anything away here, excuse me. I also think this conversation will be better served by kind of discussing a lot of the stuff that's within the film, is that you start to approach how we talk about these issues now in reference to the history of Recy Taylor.
That's correct. I think one of the reasons these stories are hidden is because we don't talk about them. We don't talk about them enough. And a theme in this film is who did report it, who talked about it, and now that we're putting it out there, you know, I think. Well, let me go back to the race films that you mentioned. You know, one of the things that's so beautiful about them is that they create a kind of mythic quality around it.
Well, actually, talk about what the race films were.
Okay, the race films are films that were made by African-American directors for black audiences, casting almost entirely black actors. And they were made in response to the way African Americans were addressed in mainstream cinema. You know, they were caricatured and demeaningly. So you had your Jezebels and your Mammies and all of that. So the race films respond to that. And in fact, one of the films that's played prominently in my film is Within Our Gates. And that's a response to Birth of a Nation, specifically, by Oscar Micheaux, very well-known African-American director. So I use them in a way to remind us that what happened to Recy Taylor didn't just happen to her. It happened to lots of women. And so the films are used in almost a kind of ghost-like way. They're not played out very much. They're just hints and metaphors for what we're seeing on the screen.
This is going to be silly, but does everybody know what Birth of a Nation is? I just want to ask that because it's so important that whenever you get the chance, you get to say that the movie that is constantly referred to as the beginning of cinema is actually the birth of the Ku Klux Klan as well. It's and
probably one of the most racist movies that you could ever see, and was accepted in those days. Not everybody believed that, but you know, the President of the United States showed it in the White House.
For decades. I mean, even if you went to film school 20 years ago, it would be kind of like, try not to pay attention to the racist stuff, but it's a beautiful film. And you'd be like, no, it's horrific.
It's horrific. Unfortunately, he was a good filmmaker. That was the problem. He was a racist, he was a bigot, but he did know how to use the camera. And that's oh boy, that's
Triumph of the Will has some beautiful camera work as well.
Exactly, right? Exactly. The power of film. It's scary.
So talk about finding those race films that you're referring to, and finding the particular images that you use. Like where do these exist? Where is the archive of these films?
You can find them in the Library of Congress. They are archived in numerous places. There is a relatively new package of them, box set by Kino Lorber, called Pioneers of African American Cinema. So I found some of them there, and I really recommend people go to look at those films. We only use a few, but I think they have 40 in their collection.
Well, when did you make the connection that you should engage with those films for this story?
You know, you talk about something being haunting. Those films have haunted me for a long time. I had seen.
You knew those films
Oh,
prior
yes.
to this story.
Oh, yes. I wouldn't say I knew them well, and I certainly studied them more once I thought they would make a good creative tool in the film. But I had seen them before and felt they were beautiful. The aesthetics of them are beautiful.
One of the things about Recy Taylor's story is not just about the progress that was made after, but it's also about how Black women have been, for the large part, sort of removed from the civil rights history. And you pose this incredible argument about that civil rights, I think you actually just mentioned it as well, so much of the civil rights movement was based off of the response to what was happening to men's sisters, men's wives.
Right, and scholars have been dealing with that for a while, and Daniel McGuire certainly does this in her book. She threads those connections, and I think it's very important to think about how African American women and their organizations and their intelligent fight for justice during that period does ultimately power the civil rights movement. It is part of the burgeoning aspects of it, and then they get removed as well. But it's important to recognize that these things have a certain organic quality, and not that I think it's right that they were removed, but you know, a lot of African American men felt emasculated during that period. They really couldn't stand up for their women. They couldn't fight back at these men who were raping them, because they would be lynched if they did. So there is a certain kind of ironic justice that they step into the civil rights movement and become the leaders. And Martin Luther King, who's of course an incredible speaker, takes center stage. And so I don't think the women in those days were unhappy about the role they played. I think they were fine being, you know, the kind of power behind the people that were more visible. But I think, you know, I think they're very happy to be more recognized as a force.
That said, being invisible behind those that were more visible, unfortunately leads to less power against the patriarchy.
That's right.
Moving forward. And what we're talking about here in terms of Black men stepping forward and taking over the civil rights movement, I'm sure it wasn't a premeditated thing, but it has a lot to do with the patriarchy, both for white people, for white women, and for Black women.
You're absolutely correct. And you know, who knew? Because I don't think people thought in terms of patriarchy in those days. They just said, all right, we need the best spokesperson we can get, and no one was more eloquent than Martin Luther King.
Well, honestly, that draws a very similar parallel once again to the LGBTQ conversations of just a few years ago, when so many LGBTQ people that were Black, that were Latino, that were trans, were saying, like, why is it only white men who are together and married? Why are they the only symbol that the rest of the country can sort of relate to?
And look at what we're looking at today. You know, it's white women who have garnered all the attention as soon as they started to speak up. And
Me Too.
The Me Too.
Yeah.
And Recy Taylor spoke up in 1944 when her life was in danger. And she wasn't alone. There were other women who did that, but not a lot. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, we don't know that much about this history, because not that many did speak up. But when you think about the courage that African American women had, whether they spoke up or not, to go through to live in this abusive culture is crazy. And now I champion anybody who speaks up, white or Black. But I certainly hope that this movie brings attention to the African American women who deserve the attention.
Absolutely. When you were editing this film, obviously I don't necessarily love #MeToo movement. There's anything that is it's very important, but anything that's hashtaggy, saying it out loud, you feel like a little.
I know.
But were you, I mean, where were you in the process of making this film when this sort of movement started? I'd imagine you were pretty much finished.
We were finished. I mean, what was prominent when we premiered this film at the Venice Film Festival, and I was struck by how many questions came to me from the European press about Charlottesville. That's what had just happened. And I had to stop and say, wait a minute, this film is all about white supremacy. This film is about white supremacists who feel they are entitled to rape black women or sleep with black women, you know, without their consent, because that's who they are. They are the master class. They were the master class during the days of slavery when they owned these women.
Or punish black women based off of decisions that the government has made. Yeah.
Right. So you know, everybody was very interested in that, and I also made the connection at that moment to the white supremacy in the Loving Story, because if it hadn't been for them, who wanted to maintain the master class and stop white men from sleeping with black, or stop children from being a result of those relationships, which diluted the blood and diluted their class status, that probably never would have happened. The Lovings wouldn't have been thrown into jail. So it looked like white supremacy was going to be the relevant issue of the day, and and then we come to, you know, the New York Film Festival, and it's right around that time. Well, I guess Harvey Weinstein scandal started, what, just a month ago?
October, I think.
Yeah, so it was right after we premiered in New York.
It's very the scandals in the last year have been like,
I know.
it's a roller coaster. I mean, actually, it's not
It
just,
is.
it doesn't never dips down. It just constantly goes up to a new one.
I know, and you know, you don't make a film with that in mind, but you know, if it draws more attention to the courage of Recy Taylor and women like her, I'm all for it. I mean, look, I think we're looking at a seismic change in our society today.
Hopefully.
Yeah, and so it's on everybody's mind. People can't stop talking about it. History becomes non-history. It's important, and I hope this is, you know, shoring it up.
Would you say that might be, forgive me, that might be one of the only, if not the only, positive of this current president right now, is that he has no idea how to diminish these scandals in a way that can sort of like, so that we can throw them under the rug. I mean, they just get worse, they get bigger and bigger because he has no idea how to just come forward and say the most, you know, the easiest diplomatic presidential things about it.
If anything, all he does is exacerbate it.
Exactly.
And
it's good and bad.
it is good and bad, but it also reminds us how easy it is to hide these stories. You know, it isn't any longer, right? But these stories are out there. They're not going to get, there's no one who's going to get a pass on this. So I'm kind of waiting to see what happens with the presidency, frankly. But, you know, every time he opens his mouth, he just intensifies the attention, not only to the overall situation, but even on himself. So let's see what happens, you know. But it has up until recently been so easy to hide these things. Thank goodness for the internet, you know. Thank goodness for the fact that we've gone past the possibility for a particular type of newspaper to ignore something. I wouldn't say suppress it. In Recy Taylor's day, the white papers did not report this very much. Black newspapers did. And I don't know whether you would say that they actually suppressed it. I don't think they did. They just didn't think it was a big story. You know, if women weren't speaking up, if they weren't coming to court, you know, if they weren't reporting it, then it gave everybody plausible deniability that it even happened. So, you know, it was the black newspapers and this committee that was formed around Recy Taylor with the help of Rosa Parks, who drew so much attention to it and put pressure on the white newspapers to report it, and that put pressure on the governor to have a second grand jury.
Now, I have to ask, just in terms of the production of this, what was it like interviewing everybody sort of as closely associated with this story as possible? I mean, you have moments where, you know, there are people who still feel like they can't tell the truth or tell the story.
That's haunting itself. It reminds you that there's still a lot of tension around it. And there was tension in those interviews, that I can say.
Really?
Oh, of course. You know, I was kind of surprised they even agreed to be interviewed, to be honest with you. But sometimes you don't even know what it is you're thinking and saying. So there are a few people that are kind of living in a world where they think it's okay.
Or they don't, and that's why they want to talk, but they also don't feel like they can talk too much, you know?
Right, they're
They
very...
know what's wrong,
Yeah.
but they don't want to indict anybody.
I really don't know what was going through their minds when they spoke. And I think that there is a kind of hedging that's going on. And, you know, I have to live in this town, and there are still people that maintain this kind of bias and bigotry, so I have to be careful. But look,
I have to live in this town, but I don't want to go to hell personally.
Correct. But look what just happened in Alabama. I mean, that's the thing. So I think people like that are going to say, wait a minute, it may not be what I thought it was. Right. So, you know, that was the good news.
We beat an alleged pedophile who believes that slavery should be brought back by 1.5%.
I know.
It's good, though. It's good.
It is kind of crazy that people like that exist. Well, I mean, it's a sickness, I guess. I'm not an expert, so I can't even say what it is. But the fact that there are people that were willing to support him, and listen, when the Loving case came down in 1967, most states by then had already agreed that interracial marriage was okay. In those, I think there were 16 states that had to go ahead and ratify that ruling, the Supreme Court ruling. But there were 2 states that didn't until the late 1990s. South Carolina in 1998, and the final state was Alabama in 2000. And when they voted to agree to, they had a referendum and they agreed to allow interracial couples to marry, a good portion of the people who voted were still against it. So
I bet you some of them are still working in government.
No.
That's so interesting that you said that, 1998, because we were talking about Prop 8, and reminds me that was 8-9 years ago.
Know.
You know,
Yeah.
like it feels like we've had marriage equality at this point. It just feels like fine, but it was just a few years ago that we got it. So these tensions have to still exist for so many people that were against it. And then when it comes to Alabama, and I mean, there was just someone from the UN in Alabama who just reported that poverty in that area is some of the worst he's ever seen in a developed country. So if the only thing that you have in a state is individual liberties changing for people who have constantly been systematically oppressed, then the rest of the people who gained from that oppression and who are not gaining economically anymore are going to blame all of that progress on that, rather than look at the sort of economic situation.
I know. It's really horrible. You know, I think it's
what you see with Roy Moore.
Yes, and let me just go back and say that I think this is one reason that documentary and film in general is so powerful and can be so important. That if we don't live we don't live in Alabama. Here we are in New York, and we have our own tensions here, of course. But we forget that so much of this happens outside of our world, and we need to understand it better. We need to develop compassion, and I think that one of the reasons that it's important to make films, even about people that aren't like yourself, it's about creating empathy. When I say I didn't know about Recy Taylor, it's because I'm a white woman who lived in the North and wasn't familiar with this history. I dare say that there are many black women whose mothers and grandmothers and aunties came from the South. They knew all about this stuff. They didn't need me to tell them. So I think that, sometimes people wonder why a white woman does make a film like this. And all I can say is that I think there are numerous perspectives to be brought to these stories and important dimensions that should be brought to it. And I hope that everybody makes them, not just me. I hope there are many black women who will. But I also think that there is something to recognize that if I didn't know this history, there are probably many other white people who didn't know it as well and should. They really should.
Yeah, I didn't know the story of Recy Taylor until I watched the documentary. Let's get some questions from our audience. Who has a question? Right here.
Hi there. Thank you for being here and bringing this story to life. Given that this was something that was overlooked, and now that you've brought it to light with this film, are there any other stories that you're working on or looking to sort of bring forth to the audience?
I always have my antenna up. There's nothing at the moment. I am working on other things. One of the things I'm working on, which doesn't really relate to your question, is I don't know if you're aware that The Loving Story was made into Loving. I was one of the producers of that. And I did make another film about a dancer who was stricken with polio at the height of her career, a woman named Tanika LeClaire. And that film is called Afternoon of a Faun, and we're turning that into a narrative. So I love the idea of finding a really important, rich story and seeing that it can live in various different forms, because I think that's what good storytelling is. So, but I'll always have my antenna up for the others.
You also made a documentary about Sidney Lumet,
That's
who I love Sidney Lumet with all my heart, and his book Making Movies by Sidney Lumet, and I think it's the greatest book about how to make a movie.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What was it like making that?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't meet him.
Right.
He had passed away by the time I started working on the film. I was asked by American Masters to work on that, and so there was a beautiful interview with him. It went over something like 16 or 18 hours.
That must be like hanging out with him then.
Yes, it was made by Danny Anker, and so what I had to do was in that interview find the storyline, because it was kind of rambling. It was 3 days, and all he did was talk about what mattered to him, which I think any artist would relish the chance to do. But I still felt like you just can't have a rambling documentary. You have to find a through story. And I did, and that was an eye-opener for me. It helped me understand Sidney Lumet's work through that interview, and I chose not to bring other people on stage. The interview was so rich and so powerful that I let him tell us his story, which is why it's called By Sidney Lumet, and showed clips of his work that reflected on what he was saying.
How did working on that and listening to 16 hours of him over and over again affect your filmmaking going forward? Did you feel like it changed you at all, or his approach to story?
Couple of things come to mind. First of all, I'm incredibly grateful to him because he doesn't hold back. He doesn't have a lot of ego. That's why Making Movies is such an important book for filmmakers, and so his generosity meant a lot to me. He talks about how making creative choices is figuring out what your story is about. And that doesn't mean what it's about in a plot sense. It's what it's about emotionally. And then everything you do serves that emotional about. And it's something that I think I probably was doing intuitively when I started, but now I'm very conscious of doing that.
One of the greatest things he said in making, and we'll move off this. I just
Well, how did we get to Sidney Lumet?
Is in making movies. He says the first thing that I ever do is if I'm bored. As soon as I'm bored by something, then I start trying to figure out what's wrong with it. But if I'm watching actors work, if I'm reading a script and I have a moment where I lose interest, then I know that I have to start asking questions about what's wrong with it.
Well, thanks for reminding me.
It's
smart. Very important because actually, getting back to Recy Taylor, this was a really hard film to make because one was challenged with telling her very intimate, dramatic, personal story and then broadening it to a much larger political dimension. And it was very important, one, that it never become pedantic. I was very concerned about this. It's a highly emotional story and a very deep one, and I didn't ever want to feel like I was lecturing. But I did have to make that larger universal point in the film. And so that's something I was conscious of, and we go through a culling process of cutting out the boring parts, or at least framing everything in a way that it never feels boring.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to know what advice you would give to young filmmakers who want to pursue documentary filmmaking and also kind of dig into these hidden stories.
Make films about things you're passionate about, and really keep your antenna up for those stories. You know, you'll come across them. But I read every newspaper, I read every magazine. Sometimes I'm amazed at, I have piles of them in my house, but I never let myself not read them because little tidbits come up. And not only do you find stories, but you also kind of understand the relevance because you tap on the culture. And of course you get that from the internet and from the web and things like that. Just don't let anything stop you. And it's hard. It's really hard work. You have to really be devoted to it because can sometimes be thankless too. It's really hard to raise money for the films, but just keep at it. You know.
When you're in the process of making a film, for instance, when you're directing and shooting and editing a film, do you watch other films at all, or are you the type of filmmaker that likes to try to just keep, you know, other people's work out of your head and focus on?
Sometimes I'm watching them inadvertently because I have to, and because I work on other films. I also consult on other films, and I work with other filmmakers, which is a total joy, by the way. It's a great community, but I don't look at a film for guidance. As a matter of fact, I often stay away from them. And I also work really hard not to look at bad movies. I mean, I'll look at movies for escape, but I look for films that have a certain quality and and reach a certain bar, because that keeps me, you know, high up there as well.
Pollute your mind.
That's right.
What's the last bad movie you saw?
No comment.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question right here.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I was wondering, since you're dealing with such heavy subject matter, how do you kind of work against the emotional toll of just the content?
I don't work against it, actually. I really do feel it. And I feel a tremendous responsibility to tell it right and to deal with it. I am concerned that, you know, if the content gets too heavy and too, you know, I don't want it to be negative. I want people to see the movie. And so I think that one of the things that I tried to do in this film was deal with the subject of rape in a sensitive way, in a very dignified way, and that the aesthetics of the film should be pull you into it and make you want to go with the story. But at the end of the day, it is a story. It's an important story. So I guess it does get me. It weighs on you. But I feel like if I'm making a good movie about it, then that's the justification for it.
Nancy, it's a beautiful film. It's haunting. Congratulations. It's playing right now, I think, at the IFC Center, right?
Tonight. It's opening. Yeah, today. It's opened at the IFC Center.
Opening today at the IFC Center. And
I'm sorry, and we have a Facebook page. Yeah. So please do come to the Facebook page and Instagram and Twitter, and we have a website. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm very excited about the fact that it's opening tonight in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Nancy Buirski, everybody, give her a round of applause.
Thank you.